Welcome, everyone. We are delighted that you could join us for today's Working Ethics into the Conversation webinar. I'm Rosalind Byrne. Before introducing today's guest speaker and discussant, there are a few process items to share with you. You are all on mute and will remain so throughout the entire session. Any communication you wish to have with our speaker or discussant will come through only in writing. Please post any questions in the Q&A box. That button can be found at the bottom of your screen. We will attempt to acknowledge and read all of your questions and to have them answered and discussed, though this cannot be guaranteed. The Online Ethics Center, also known as the OEC, is a project of the National Academy of Engineering in partnership with the Center for Biology and Society at Arizona State University and the Illinois Institute of Technology's Center for the Study of Ethics in the Professions. The Working Ethics into the Conversation webinar series is a collaboration with the Engineering Ethics Division of the American Society for Engineering Education, ASEE. We especially thank the National Science Foundation for their support of the OEC. The OEC provides a host of ethics resources for faculty, students, and practitioners of engineering and science. It will soon be host to a forum on teaching ethics for STEM faculty new to teaching ethics and wanting to explore, share, and reflect inside the community about ethics instruction in engineering and science. Today's presentation features Dr. Brent Jesiek, Associate Professor of Purdue University with joint appointments in the School of Engineering Education and the School of Electrical Engineering at Purdue University. He's chair of the graduate program in the School of Engineering Education. Dr. Jesiek leads the Global Engineering Education Collaboratory Research Group and serves as a co-editor for the Journal of International Engineering Education. He is joined today by discussant Dr. Paul Gannon, Associate Professor of Chemical and Biological Engineering at Montana State University, Bozeman. Welcome, Dr. Jesiek, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Rosalind, and the National Academies for the generous invite to present. I'm looking forward to sharing what is about 10 years or more of work at the intersection of global engineering education and engineering ethics education. And hopefully we'll give you a few tidbits or tools that you might be able to take away and use today.
That's great. Thank you. Dr. Jesiek, you're joined by discussant Paul Gannon. Welcome, Dr. Gannon. We're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Roz. Really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to learning from Brent and asking some naive questions along the way.
Terrific. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and welcome you, Brent, to share yours.
All right, there we go. So I've taken this charge to talk about teaching ethics in an international context, perhaps a little bit broadly, but I will get there. So let me just start by briefly sort of situating this work in relation to some of my research. First, by acknowledging that the work that I'm presented here is linked to a number of NSF grants over the years, but in particular these two grants that the National Science Foundation has supported. So I just want to acknowledge and thank the National Science Foundation for supporting a number of aspects of this work over the years. As I said, oops, don't know why I did that, sorry. Let's try this again. There we go. As I said, a number of the things that I'm talking about today are really tied to what I see as a broader research portfolio that I have developed as a faculty member and graduate student, which in very broad terms looks at technical professionals in school and at work, and is particularly focused on developing various kinds of professional competencies. And the work that I've done has specifically tended to focus on global competency, and that's sort of the global engineering education angle, boundary spanning in engineering practice, and ethics and social responsibility. And through this work, I've tended to frame a lot of it around questions of definitions. How do we understand what competencies and capabilities are important and needed for engineers, and that we start developing as engineering students? How do we develop those capabilities among our students and professionals? What kinds of educational environments, training interventions, that sort of thing can support competence development? And then finally, on the assessment side, how do we measure or evaluate the ability of a student or professional in these various domains of competency? And it happens today that much of what I'm talking about is really at that intersection of global competency and engineering ethics and social responsibility, which I think is has been maybe historically a bit underexplored in the literature, but is perhaps more important and relevant than ever in the current context. Just more broadly too, sort of a foundational assumption for me is that engineering is primarily a socio-technical activity, that rarely can we separate the social dimensions of engineering work from the technical dimensions. They are frequently intertwined with one another. And you'll probably see a little flavor of that in the work that I'm about to present. So today's talk is organized roughly in three parts. First, I want to walk through some foundational claims. This sort of will hopefully help position how I think about engineering ethics in relation to other types of competencies, in terms of student and professional development, and about engineering ethics and what that means in an international context. Then I'm going to turn to a situational judgment approach to teaching and potentially assessing engineering ethics. This is a technique and method that I've been developing and playing with and exploring for a long time. And so I'll give you a little window onto that work and share some resources for how I do this and how it might be useful for you in your teaching and instructional efforts. As I say here, there's an assessment aspect to this as well, but I'm going to sort of allude to that in some places, but the primary focus here is on the teaching aspect. So those who are interested in the assessment part, we can follow up later with some conversation or some, explore some references in that space. I'm going to sort of tie that to two kinds of scaffolding that I try to provide students in learning engineering ethics and global engineering ethics. I'm going to share one process-based resource that I like to use and one knowledge-based resource. So in terms of foundational claims, I'm going to walk through 4 of these. I think some are maybe more or less controversial than others. This may seed some additional discussion. In some places here, I've also indicated some relevant references that have guided my thinking on this. First of all, I want to underscore when we think about the ABET outcomes in the ethics space, the current ABET criteria 3.4 states that graduates should have an ability to recognize ethical and professional responsibilities in engineering situations and make informed judgments. This clearly points to a need for ethical attentiveness and moral reasoning capabilities, and I don't want to downplay the importance of those, but my view is that ethical awareness and judgment is also frequently linked to and involves other considerations like emotion, intuition, personality, cultural influences, group dynamics, and many other factors. And you'll see some reflection of that in my presentation today. And one of the methods in particular that I present that is a process-based approach is designed to address some of those emotion and intuition dynamics that might cloud or change judgment that someone has in a particular situation. I also think it's important to link ethics more broadly to professional formation and morality. It is certainly important as we think about the cultivating the ability of engineers to effectively navigate ethical situations. I think we need to think about how that is necessarily linked to broader processes of first professional formation, which is really focused on establishing one's professional identity and really building up a wider repertoire of technical and professional competencies. So I really don't think we can look at engineering ethics in isolation. I think we need to think about how it connects to practice more broadly. I also think we need to think about how it relates to a lifelong process of moral development, where oftentimes we can't rigidly separate what we would consider morality, sort of personal morality, with professional ethics. I think there's a lot of evidence that those two things are often linked in ways that we don't fully understand. My third claim is that we need to take a broader view of ethics education. Engineering ethics education, in my view, demands across and beyond the curriculum approaches, and I think that includes through targeted interventions in both technical and professional courses, and in reflection activities and other scaffolds that support learning in a wide variety of settings. So not just the classroom, but through extracurricular activities, the workplace, etc. And also being aware of and needing to be responsive to individual differences in moral development and ethical competence. In particular, students come to university with different levels of moral development, different moral sensitivities, different understandings of what it means to have integrity or be ethical. That development may or may not continue. It may even regress during their college years. And some of the other dimensions we've seen related to this is that based on where a student is and their own personal inclinations towards morality and ethics, often guides them to self-select into certain kinds of experiences. So for example, a student with relatively higher levels of moral engagement might gravitate more towards service learning experiences, for example. So those self-selection dynamics might work against us because the students who might most benefit from certain kinds of interventions might not be receiving them because they're not opting into the programs that would have the biggest impacts on those types of outcomes. All right, my fourth claim is that we need to take a pluralistic view of engineering culture. And there are certainly debates in the literature over this question of to what extent can we view engineering practice and the engineering profession sort of monolithically across the globe, or whether we need to take a more pluralistic view. My argument is that there are significant variations in engineering culture and practice around the world, including significant local and regional differences in what counts as engineering ethics and professional integrity. And so part of what I'm presenting here is to really highlight and underscore those kinds of differences that students and professionals may encounter as they work with engineers from other countries and cultures. They engage in global supply chains, they work with suppliers around the world, etc. I think I'm not alone in this view, so I just pulled a few quotes from a variety of sources. Alan Parkinson from Brigham Young has written on this topic and talked about different global competencies that are important. He's written about the importance of professional engineers being able to effectively deal with ethical issues arising from cultural or national differences. The American Society for Civil Engineers in their Body of Knowledge report also refers to the challenge of practicing ethically in a global environment and underscores the need for educational institutions to prepare students for that reality. And in some of our own research looking at global engineering practice, we identified ethics standards and regulations as a key area of engineering culture when we look globally, and wrote about or sort of define that as when technical coordination or technical problem solving happens in the midst of multiple and often conflicting normative and or policy contexts. And again, I think there's a growing body of evidence to support that is indeed often the case. So in light of these realities, I'm now going to turn more to the teaching side of this to get at how I try to bring some of these realities into the classroom, particularly by using a situational approach to teaching ethics in international context. And so this particular approach is in part inspired by situational judgment assessment methods and scenario and case-based instructional approaches. And again, if folks would like more references on those topics, I'm happy to share. And there is a parallel line of work with this that looks at development of situational judgment test questions to more systematically and rigorously assess the abilities of engineers to work in global context. And there'll be a Journal of Engineering Education paper coming out this summer that focuses on that assessment side of the house. So keep an eye out for that if you want to learn more on the assessment side. The approach I'm going to show you today is also, I would argue, compatible with what Michael Davis has called for a micro-insertion strategy to bring more ethics into technical courses. And again, that is also compatible with what I've argued about really an across the curriculum and beyond the curriculum approach to finding more creative ways to bring ethics into courses and other types of learning experiences. I do also want to acknowledge that most of the scenarios that we've developed for this type of work are primarily concerned with what have been called microethical issues. And of course, I'm using Joe Herkert's language here. But I do have a scenario I want to share at the end that sort of mixes microethical and macroethical concerns, which might be of interest to some of you, given sometimes challenges faced with bringing macroethical concerns into the classroom. This scenario at the end, I'd be interested in hearing your feedback about whether that might be a way to do it. And I'm not real huge on shameless self-promotion, so this is my one place for that. The research project that this is mainly based involved creating more than 70 global scenarios of the type I create. I'm going to be demonstrating, and about a quarter to a third of those focus on ethics and related issues. And so folks who are looking for more examples and other resources, you can go to this URL here to check those out. If you're looking for access to more of the scenarios, there's only a subset posted there. Just send me an email and I'm happy to share more materials with folks, because we've held some of the scenarios back because they're still undergoing development, particularly for assessment purposes. So we're not quite ready to release them.
And this is an unsolicited plug for this resource. I had the opportunity to peruse this website and was impressed by the number of resources as well as the implementability of these resources into classes, and I'm looking forward to test driving this.
Great, thanks, Paul. And I think, in addition to what I demonstrate here today, we do have some instructional guides available, which sort of provide some roadmaps for how you might use these types of scenarios in the classroom and maybe lower the implementation burden a little bit for these. So, all right, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to one of these situations, and I do want to get into a little bit of discussion around this, perhaps in dialogue with Paul, but also perhaps using the chat window a little bit. So just hold tight for a few more minutes. I'm going to walk you through some important aspects of this, and then we'll go through a bit of a structured engagement around the scenario, which I was puzzling a little bit how to introduce this, and I decided that I would introduce it a bit like I would introduce this in a classroom setting, so you have a sense for the typical flow and structure that I've developed, and I think works pretty well when introducing these scenarios to undergraduate students. Now, this particular scenario is developed from a longer case study. So it's one of the reasons I'm sharing this one is because it does have about a 3-page write-up and guide that you could use to help facilitate it. So this is a really easy one to bring into the classroom because it's got a nice set of resources. We just took a longer case study and distilled it down to about a paragraph. Again, you might prefer the shorter version, you might prefer the longer version, but both of those are available. So this one's called Wine with Lunch, and it is focused on the French context. For those who are auditory learners, I'll just go ahead and read it. As a chemical engineer working for a US-based multinational firm, you travel to the company's plant in France to support development of a new product. One day during your lunchtime at a local bistro, you noticed that 3 French technicians from the plant had finished 2 bottles of wine and were about to polish off a 3rd before going back to work. When you returned to the office, you informed the plant manager that the technicians had consumed large amounts of alcohol despite regularly working with poisonous and corrosive chemicals. He replied by saying it is very normal for the French to enjoy a leisurely lunch with wine, and added that since the workers do so frequently, it seems the alcohol does not affect them. He tells you not to worry and that wine is even served during lunch at the company canteen. What would you do? So before diving into the what would you do, I want to introduce you to some of the resources that I like to provide students to work through and grapple with these types of short cases or scenarios. The first tool that I introduce is called the DIE framework. And this is borrowed from intercultural training materials that were developed by Milton and Janet Bennett and others going all the way back to the 1970s. And one of the reasons I really like this framework is because it's simple, it's easy to remember, and one of its main goals is to slow down your evaluation process to avoid making assumptions or wrongly make assumptions when you're facing some sort of a difficult or new situation. So the DIE framework challenges us to first make sure we understand the facts of the case. Now, in this case, you are basically given the scenario, so there's not much described work that we can do. If you're doing a longer case study, or you're watching a video, or watching a simulation, or a situation acted out, that's where the described scenario would be a higher priority. We're going to focus primarily on the second and third steps, which are interpret and evaluate, or the so what and the now what. Interpretation is about asking what moral or ethical considerations might be relevant for a given case or scenario, and also thinking more broadly about what other issues might be relevant. For example, those could be organizational, cultural, personality, work styles, all those different types of things that somehow might be coming into the situation. And the next piece of this is about evaluation. So once we've done description and interpretation, only then do we turn to evaluate and ask those now what questions. So what is your evaluation or recommendation for a given case or scenario? And what should be done? And how would you justify this course of action? Now, of course, this is a leading question, because when I say justify this course of action, justify based on what? And for that, I think it's helpful to really identify what knowledge resources might be useful. So when I do this with students, I often brainstorm with them when faced with an ethical dilemma or situation. What resources, theories, frameworks, and guidelines might inform or support your decision making? And oftentimes when I'm teaching this, or even doing workshops, we identify knowledge-based resources, for example, related to, in this case, cultural differences. So we need to think about, in general, what cultural differences might be relevant in a given situation, but what differences potentially in engineering culture might be different. I especially like to use Hofstede's cultural framework to look generally at cultural differences. And when I do longer form teaching, we talk a lot about the history of engineering and engineering culture in the countries in question. Obviously, ethical codes from various engineering professional societies are potentially relevant. And this also provides an opening for students to ask, what are the ethics codes in France? Are there ethics codes in France? If there's not, how would that be relevant or not relevant? What would we do with that? I like to introduce students to the micro versus macro ethics distinction as another tool. Again, that might not be as relevant for this scenario, although I could see some ways you could bring it in. But the final scenario I will share can certainly be related to both micro and macro ethical considerations. And then finally, I do like to introduce students to some ethical theories as a tool to think with in these types of scenarios. So for example, I typically at minimum introduce consequentialism, virtue ethics, and deontology. Again, I'm not going to do that probably in a very short presentation. This would be more like a class where I've got a couple weeks to cover ethics material. In a short workshop, I might not spend as much time on this. So I'm going to come back to the scenario now, and I'm going to put Paul on the spot a little bit, but also invite some input from the chat. So I want to start with the interpret side here and really solicit input from the group about what is going on here. What are some salient factors, considerations? What should we be thinking about? Again, I want you to hold your thoughts on what we should do in this situation, and instead focus on what are the relevant things to consider. And oftentimes, then interpretation may be a list of questions or unknowns or things that we want to look into or consider or research or try to get familiar with or try to find out about. So I'm going to pause there and turn it over to Paul, and then start monitoring the chat box.
Sure. So Brent, first off, I like the approach in which you have the scenario before introducing some of the knowledge-based components of the ethics. But Nonetheless, in this scenario, my job is to interpret what's going on here, and it was interesting to put myself into this hypothetical. To be honest, it made me want to move to France a little bit, just for a second. But now that I see this, the interpretation, I have already told my supervisor about my observations of the French technicians, of the technicians having up to 3 bottles of wine. The interpretation, again, that the supervisor told me is that there's some normative habits of the French technicians that is acceptable and in fact condoned by the institution by serving us at the company canteen. And also the type of wine could make a significant difference in terms of a very lightweight wine versus a heavy wine in terms of the alcohol content. So I have this, the multinational company. We're perhaps based in the US, or at least I'm based in the US. So I'm coming from those contexts, understanding a drastically different culture and cultural contexts, seeing something that might be impermissible in my cultural context happening in a different cultural context, and I'm trying to reconcile those things. So I guess that's what I'm interpreting right now. And struggling with that, and reading through this, I've already gone to the effort of informing the supervisor at hand. And so I suppose I have a predisposition that this is challenging to me, and I ought to do something about it. So I do have some ethical dilemma here that I'm confronting, and these are the things that are going through my head. I'd like to know the relevant policies, of course, that are at play, written and otherwise, and then interpret those in context of the situation and then readdress.
Right. Great overview, Paul. I think, a lot of the issues that you raised are very similar to what tend to surface organically in a conversation that we would have with students. And so the types of issues that are surfacing here in terms of the French cultural context and what is normal in terms of behaviors in France that might not be normal elsewhere. And there's a bit of a when in Rome, do as the Romans do sort of dimension to this potentially. There are questions around the legal environment. Are there French laws that would prohibit this behavior? Are there corporate policies that would prohibit this behavior? There are questions around the chain of command. So who is ultimately responsible for this? What is your responsibility in that chain of command, particularly as a visitor in that plant and as in some ways a guest in that facility? There are, of course, unknowns here. Do you really have a good sense for the type of wine being consumed? What is the alcohol content? What is the quantity? Is there some misunderstanding here in terms of the behavior of these employees? And so, again, I think and I see similar issues coming up in the chat window. So again, I'm just demonstrating this is a kind of range of issues that we would tend to try to identify and unpack before moving into sort of an action or problem solving mode. And I should note too, again, this is, those of us trained as engineers, right, this is both a blessing and a curse. We go very quickly to problem solving mode. We start looking for solutions to problems, right? And so part of the challenge here is how do you slow down that cognitive process a little bit and, really do what a good engineer does in terms of coming up with what are the baseline assumptions that I'm making? What information do I have and not have? What do I need to find out more about? How do I justify a course of action beyond just simply saying, well, my gut says to go with X, Y, or Z? So with that brief demonstration of sort of the interpretation process, let me jump to the next slide. Typically what I do next, once we sort of have a pool of factors, considerations, issues, unknowns, is we start brainstorming possible courses of action. Now, of course, some of those follow very naturally from the resources or a lack of resources, where we start looking, for example, at information we might need to find or questions we might need to answer. But we also, of course, try to identify some possible courses of action which more directly try to address the problem at hand. So let me go ahead and jump ahead to this next slide.
Excuse me, Brent, did you want for me to tell you about the questions that have come in, or would you like to hold on that?
let's go ahead and do that. I was having a hard time tracking them, but I'm happy
Yes.
to, if you can manage that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Let me read a few to you. What I noticed is that the engineer already judged the alcohol consumption as, quote, a large amount of alcohol. What is this judgment based on? Parentheses, sorry, I'm European and I know about this issue.
Yeah, I think this is a good point, that the framing of the scenario is maybe a little bit loaded in that regard. And so part of the challenge here is encouraging folks to step back from what might be an implicit evaluation that's in the scenario and unpack that and really challenge some of the assumptions that might even be embedded in how the scenario is framed. So I think that's a great point, and I love having the European perspective on the webinar. That's fantastic.
Absolutely. There's another. What are the laws regulating alcohol and chemical engineering in France, and are there company policies in play as well as international corporations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's one of the unknowns here that we need to grapple with. And so this could be a springboard for students to go off and find out what those policies are before making a decision or evaluation if this was turned into a longer case exercise. Or we could sort of put those in a parking lot and say, well, depending on what answers we find to those questions, here are some possible courses of action that we could pursue based on those results. So for example, if you find that there's no corporate policies, you still need to figure out a way to act.
One more, or would you like to proceed?
I'll do one more, sure.
Okay. So this question actually is from Fran Ligler. Why is not safety a major consideration in terms of the responsibility of the technician, ethics of putting others at risk, ethics of potential negative impact on the products?
I think this really gets at the heart of the dilemma in the scenario, is trying to understand why it seems as though the safety consideration maybe isn't taking the forefront, or maybe there's a perception that safety is not taking a forefront when, upon further investigation, you find that actually the concerns maybe aren't as you thought.
I'll hold there.
Great, thank you. So now I'd like to pivot to the evaluation side of this. And again, when I do the evaluation piece with students, I always make clear that our goal is to identify a wide range of possible ways of dealing with a situation. And I tell students initially, don't try to give me the right answer. Give me a wide variety of ways of potentially dealing with a situation, whether it's good, bad, ugly, or otherwise, that we have options to pick from. And your idea of a good solution might be someone else's idea of a bad solution. So we really do try to generate a wide range of ways of handling the situation. Now, we've at this point focused primarily on follow-up actions that involve getting more information. So those are clearly on the table. But there's a lot of other possibilities here in terms of addressing this situation. So again, I'd like to open it up to the floor, maybe starting with Paul, to comment on some potential next steps that we could take in this situation.
Sure. So my mind goes to kind of the spectrum, and on both ends would be do nothing, or on one end would be do nothing at all and let bygones be bygones. The other end would be, use the quote out of the media, the nuclear option, and go to the supervisor of the supervisor and perhaps armed with the policies that I found, make a deal out of it. I think there's a variety of other options that one could take, confronting the technicians directly, confronting the supervisor directly, resigning, and perhaps even embracing the culture and joining the technicians during their next lunch. So these are just some options, but I would be entertained in a classroom coming up with these options with students. I think the students would be heavily engaged in that as well. And I like the framing that you're doing here in terms of slowing the process down and framing the ethical dilemma such that the students don't jump to these conclusions or have their assumptions drive their interpretations.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Paul. And there's typically two ways that I will facilitate the evaluation portion of these conversations. One would be to just really stop here and have the students generate the list of possibilities. And I typically, to engage them further, I have them vote. We'll actually vote and see where, we'll sort of take the temperature and see where students are lining up in terms of what they think would be the most and least favorable courses of action. That also provides an opportunity for them to provide justification. So again, going back to that interpretation and even the description step, really testing how are they understanding the situation and the key issues, and then what resources are they mobilizing to justify particular courses of action. And I often underscore there's usually not one right answer in these types of situations. There's a range of possibilities, and really that process of analysis and justification is a critical dimension of what engineers need to learn how to do situationally. I'm going to jump to the next slide, though, which outlines, for some of these scenarios, we do have a set of possibilities. And again, these can be used with or without the student input. And we, in part, develop the possible courses of action based on input from subject matter experts. And then this becomes an important part of the assessment pathway, where we can actually give these to students and have them rate the effectiveness of these different options as an assessment tool. So again, that's sort of a parallel line, but I did want to share with you the 8 options that have that really came out from our research around potential ways to handle the scenario. So number 1 is send an email to the plant manager that again states your concerns. And again, one of the things that is trying to happen there is you're trying to document in some fashion that you've reported the concerns to the plant manager. You seek out the plant manager's supervisor. That's maybe, Paul, what you were describing as the nuclear option, right? To say, well, I'm going to take this up the chain. Number 3 is asking the plant manager for written confirmation that the practice is acceptable. Again, this goes a little farther down that line of getting formal documentation of what you're observing and sort of maybe absolving yourself in some way. You could report the issue back to U.S. headquarters, which is maybe a bit of a nuanced variation of reporting to the plant manager's supervisor. For example, you might have a ethics compliance staff or hotline that you could report to. As we talked about, you could find relevant policies on alcohol use in the company's handbook and then share those with the plant manager. Maybe a little bit less of a direct approach. As you pointed out, Paul, you could take no further action in this situation. You could directly confront the technicians and tell them that you'll report them if you see this happening again. And you could ask a more experienced colleague for advice. Now, one of the things to observe here is when we created these sets of responses, typically we try to have a really kind of wide range of options, in particular options that are indexed to or reflect lower amounts of cultural knowledge, cultural sensitivity, and ethics knowledge and sensitivity, to options that potentially reflect higher amounts of ethical knowledge and sensitivity and higher amounts of cultural knowledge and sensitivity. So any of the scenarios where we have some options like this, there's an expectation that you've got kind of a wide range of possibilities, as Paul said, from the one end of the spectrum to the other, but many falling also in between in interesting, nuanced ways. So I think as a final point, I'm happy to have more discussion around this scenario, but I did also sort of as a closing point before we open up to broader discussion, I wanted to share one more scenario with you that I think is interesting in the way that it opens up kind of a mix of both micro and macro ethical issues. And so let me turn to
Brent, would this be a good time to tell you that Joe Herkick actually has a question?
I would be happy to address that. Thanks.
He says, does the manager's assumption that frequent use of alcohol mean it does not affect them pass muster?
I think that's a great question, and I think in justifying one's actions, that is something that might need to be addressed. Yeah. Thanks, Joe. So let me, I'm just going to introduce this last scenario. This one is a little bit different. So this one is called Healthy Ingredients. It's one that we actually didn't end up developing response options for. So I don't have a set of canned responses. I just wanted to share it as another example, which I think could generate interesting discussion. And I should note real quickly, one of the reasons we didn't end up using this one is because it was set in Honduras, and we ended up focusing on different cultural contexts. And so the scenarios that we did end up developing were all in the countries that we focused on were China, France, Germany, Japan, Mexico, and India. So if you go to the website and you look at the resources, those 6 countries tend to be the focus. But this was kind of a leftover that we didn't end up moving forward, but thought it'd be worth sharing. So as a process engineer working in the food processing industry, you would always hope to be given an assignment at one of your firm's Latin American locations. Finally, the email came, a trip to Honduras to check out how the new packaging line is running at the company's local snack processing plant. You arrive and meet with a local process engineer who appears nervous and concerned. After gentle urging, she confides in you that she uncovered a serious concern. She shares that instead of using the US imported raw ingredients for the snack production line, the local plant manager and director of purchasing have been selling them for a profit in the local market, substituting cheaper Mexican alternatives. She is confident that the snacks produced are still meeting company quality standards, and was torn to even tell you because the profits were reportedly used to subsidize healthcare expenses of the local employees. What would you do? So I'll pause there for a moment and see if Paul has any just immediate reactions before I close.
Well, now I know to approach it with the die strategy, and would step back and frame this ethical dilemma, which it's a complex one, and wonder first, my gut reaction was, why doesn't the company have healthcare for the Latin American employees? But certainly you could dive into all of the different nuances and options. And one question I guess I had from the previous slide and would generate in this scenario as well is there a reasonable a number of options that the students come up with or as a class that, you know, at some point you come to a point of diminishing returns in terms of the number of options being too many choices for the students to explore? How do you do that down selection, and what is the appropriate number of options that you can actually apply the assessment protocols to?
That's a great question. So just reflecting now, when I do these exercises with students or in workshops, we usually reach saturation around 7, maybe 10 at most options. And oftentimes what I'll do as well is I will sort of on the fly sometimes combine options if they're kind of close to each other, or, you know, I try not to build out too many sort of corollaries and conditions. So I tend to simplify it. And, you know, if you're sort of in the range to 7 to 9, that usually, you know, in my view, that typically gives you a nice range of possibilities. If there's something, a really effective approach that they're missing, and I know that based on previous work, I will try to seed that as well. And if I can't draw it out, I might come in with an option that they haven't thought of that might be particularly effective. Now, when we, and this very much aligns to when we developed the response options based on, we did it based on both expert and novice inputs. So we presented these types of scenarios to engineering students who obviously hadn't had any experience typically in these types of situations, but also to practicing professionals who potentially did. And when we did that and collected a lot of different potential response options, we tended to narrow down to somewhere in the 6 to 8 response range for these. And then when we actually go through the development of the assessment instruments, usually we end up down to 4 or 5. Or we throw it out entirely because we're not getting good convergence. Okay. So what we've actually found is that sometimes the most promising scenarios for instructional use are the least promising for assessment, because the assessment ones tend to be a little bit more, not necessarily black and white, but there's a little better sense of what is a more or less effective way of handling that situation, especially among 4 or 5 options. Whereas the ones that tend to generate really rich discussion in the classroom are probably have a little bit more gray to them and a little bit more interpretive flexibility, but they make for really rich discussions with the students. So yeah, in short, in class settings, I can do one of these exercises, go through the whole process, generate and vote on maybe 7 to 9 options, and I can probably do that in 15 minutes or so with a class.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, Brent. And I'm excited to test drive some of this stuff. The level of students appropriate for this dialogue, do you try this in freshman classes as well as in senior classes? And do you measure the differences in those discussions? And as well, I also wonder about the positionality of the hypotheticals here. I am the engineer, but do you also ask the students at an occasion to take the roles of the other individuals within the scenarios?
Yeah, those are really good questions. I will tell you that I have used these scenarios with freshmen up to professionals. With the freshman groups, I probably have to provide a little more guidance, but I even bring some of these into my freshman engineering classes, especially to talk about team dynamics, because they often work on teams that have a mix of domestic and international students and many other differences as well, right? So I do bring some of the more team-oriented ones into the freshman classes to help them reflect on cultural dynamics in team settings. And that tends to work pretty well. Again, that would probably be a bit of a simplified approach where I might not get as much into the resources and the process, but more just to kind of go straight at the issue of multicultural teamwork. Your second question, I just lost it. Sorry. Remind me.
The position of the.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Do you ask them to change their position or their viewpoints and see if their reflections change?
Yeah. So. Because the scenarios were written really for assessment purposes, we made the choice to put them sort of, in the hypothetical eye. What would you do in this situation? Because we want to get as close to possible as a behavioral response for the individual in the shoes of whoever the protagonist is. I do think that's a good point of feedback. I haven't done that kind of role playing explicitly with these. I think it's a great idea. In some of the training that I do, we do talk about other analytical techniques to think about the location, knowledge, and desire of other actors in a situation. So I could see how that could be a really nice hook into, having them do a little bit more of a role play and reflection around some of the other, actors that are presented in the scenario. So I think it's a great idea, and it would be very complementary. But again, that's where I think bringing in other tools and frameworks to help them systematically think through that. And so, again, what I'm referring to is Gary Downey developed a location, knowledge, desire framework for the engineering cultures course at Virginia Tech originally, and I do use that in some of the training. And so, again, it's a structured way to analyze the positionality of different actors in a situation, and that would be a really useful tool to, I think, couple with this.
Great, thanks. Towards the beginning of the presentation, not to diverge from this, but you had mentioned the students incoming with their pre-existing dispositions, moralities, worldviews, and how that might morph over the course of our 4-5-year programs. What measures, can you speak of the standardized measures that might be in place for incoming freshmen? And you also mentioned that perhaps that might be an opportunity to identify those that we could target for interventions or encourage to participate in efficacious learning activities that would help them develop further.
Yeah, that's a great question. I could do a whole nother talk on that. Yeah.
Sorry, so it's so
no, it's a great question. I think we need to do more work in this area. I mean, we're at the end of a longitudinal study where we did use some measures to look at student perceptions of ethics and social responsibility from their first to their final year. And so I'm happy to put people in touch with some of the results that are coming out of that. But, there are some measures out there that, I think are promising. There's some good measures of moral reasoning, moral development. Many are familiar with the DIT2 scale, the defining issues test. There are some engineering specific variations of that type of test. Carla Zoltowski has an instrument. Some other colleagues have developed engineering specific instruments of that type. A lot of the validation and development work for those types of tools is ongoing, but I think there's some promising work there. We also look at things like measures of moral disengagement. We and some other colleagues are starting to look at moral foundation measures, which go back a little bit more to the morality side of the house. Angela Bielefeld has an engineering social responsibility scale that is showing some promise in detecting some of these differences. There's something called the PSIS scale, which we've used a lot, which is a political and social involvement scale. Again, that tends to index pretty well to students showing a propensity for engaging in certain types of socially oriented experiences. And so again, if you find students measuring low on that, that might be identifying students who need other kinds of opportunities or baby steps to move them more into thinking about ethics and social responsibility. So I don't have a coherent framework or answer, but I think there are some promising tools that a lot of us are playing with to try to figure that out.
Great. And one other comment, somewhat relatedly, how about faculty and the predispositions that faculty have to implementing some of these things in their classroom, the willingness and the, I guess, motivations for doing so, and the preparedness of faculty to incorporate the affective domain in addition to the cognitive domain that they might be more comfortable with?
Yeah, that hasn't been our focus, but I have a number of colleagues who are working on that challenge. I mean, I certainly see this as an issue in trying to get this work out. And again, one of the goals here is by presenting what I think is a relatively accessible approach. Maybe those who are interested but wary might try this out and bring this into some of even their more core technical classes. And especially given the wide range of sort of disciplines and fields and topics, they might find something that resonates with what topic they're teaching. But it is a larger issue. I mean, there's probably a group that isn't going to do this, no matter how hard I try. My colleague Andrew Katz at Virginia Tech worked on that question for his dissertation and interviewed a lot of faculty members. And so some of the work that's coming out of that research is suggesting what might be some ways of engaging faculty who are reluctant. And it's a similar problem, I think, to that question of how do we engage that group of students who are interested or curious but reluctant. But you're absolutely right. The faculty development and faculty motivation side is a really big challenge in this.
Brent and Paul, I don't want to disrupt a really interesting dialogue here, but because it's now 8 minutes before, I want you to know that there are quite a number of questions in the QA. So if you give me permission, I'd like to pose a few before we wrap up.
That would be fantastic. I did want to, before we jump into that, I did want to acknowledge some colleagues who have been influential on a lot of this work over the years and who are sort of in the background of a lot of the slides, particularly Gary Downey, Joe Herkert, Michael Louie, Sang Woo, Chin Zhu, and then all of my C-STEM collaborators, Shiloh Howland, Carla Zoltowski, Stephanie Clausen, and Da-Young Kim. Thank you all, and happy to answer questions.
That's great. All right, let's see. Let's see where to begin. Do you use a think, pair, share approach when you divide the students into small groups, usually of 2, to discuss the scenario first and then share with the class, or do they respond individually?
It depends how much time I have, but if I do have longer time and I'm able to dedicate more time, I do typically do a think, pair, share or small groups to have those discussions. And that does tend to be, I mean, that's just beneficial in a lot of ways. It brings more voices into the conversation. It lets them do sort of a first level of filtering on the discussion before it gets out to the class. So yeah, I absolutely recommend that. It works really well with these.
Okay. And then from Zach Priddle, can you talk about challenges in scaling engineering ethics education approaches like this? Is enough being done in having ABET standards to judge if students are learning this? P.S. Thanks for the talk.
Yeah, that's another question that could be a whole nother talk. And I'm not sure I have good answers. I mean, again, part of the goal here was to introduce some techniques that might be more accessible. My personal view is we're not doing enough. My personal view is there's a lot of programs where ethics really is covered in a pretty perfunctory manner. My own frank evaluation is that typically the professional outcomes are not what is going to cause a flag on an ABET evaluation. Based on what I've gleaned talking to folks who've been involved on both sides of the ABET the ABET site visits. I think that's an ongoing conversation we need to keep having, and both with ABET and with our colleagues, because I'm not convinced that the ethics criteria are always taken seriously, including in the accreditation process. And I am also concerned that in a lot of programs, what happens is ethics and all the other professional outcomes tend to get bundled up and placed outside the core of the technical curriculum. So they appear in professional seminars, they appear in elective courses, they appear in places that really reinforce this separation of the technical and social dimensions of the curriculum, and really at the same time reinforce the idea that the technical components are most important. When in reality, a majority of an engineer's practice is going to involve a mix of social and technical issues on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. And let me just remind our participants that you may not know, the last webinar was Becky Bates was the presenter, and it was teaching ethics in the context of ABET requirements. That's posted on the site if you'd like to see that. So then there's a question, do you have scenarios in your collection that raise engineering challenges, e.g., how to address a professional disagreement about product modifications in a Boeing or VW type of situation, or quality compromise, that also pose cultural team HR challenges?
Yeah, great question. So when we develop the scenarios, we develop them in 3 different categories covering the 6 countries I mentioned. And those 3 categories are technical coordination, engineering cultures, and ethics standards and regulations. But as you might imagine, those issues tend to blur, especially many of them into ethics, because if we're dealing with issues of design problems or we're dealing with quality control issues, those quickly become ethical issues. So even scenarios that we might primarily frame as a technical coordination problem, for example, it's a disagreement over a design issue, or it's an engineering cultures issue, which might be a difference in opinions about how you analyze or troubleshoot or solve a problem. Often those can shade very quickly into ethics challenges. So the short answer is yes, a lot of the scenarios could lend themselves to sort of that intersection of the technical issue with the associated ethical considerations.
Thank you. And from Stephanie Bird, who asks, the "what would you do" approach is very helpful for getting students to think explicitly about their own risks and responsibilities. But the interpret step seems to give insufficient emphasis on thinking carefully about what the ethical and other issues are, especially individual assumptions and biases. What do you think, Brent?
That's a great question, and I think one of the challenges is potentially the time limitations and how much time you have to do that kind of work. I mean, my ideal environment for using these scenarios is in a semester-long global engineering class, where not only are we spending multiple weeks on the ethics dimensions, we're spending multiple weeks on the cultural dimensions, and we're also doing a lot of work on intercultural development, which is a lot about how one engages with cultural difference, which becomes a lot about one's own individual values, biases, assumptions, right? So I think the ideal situation is being environments where we can do a lot of that individual reflection work around one's own moral perspective, one's perceptions of ethics, morality, integrity, those types of things. But of course, that's not always feasible or possible. And it's also a challenge. I think most engineering faculty aren't necessarily trained to do that type of thing. So that falls on maybe certain types of instructors and courses. But I agree with you. I think that's a really important part of it, and it's one that we don't focus on enough.
Yeah. Well, closing thoughts, Brent or Paul?
This was a fantastic learning experience for me. I really appreciate it, Brent, and Ross, thanks for the invite.
Oh, thank you both. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again, Roz, and the rest of the NAE team. This was a lot of fun, and I do want to encourage folks. I didn't have a chance to compile a reference list, but if anyone's looking for information related to any aspect of my talk, please feel free to follow up via email. I'd be happy to share materials and resources.
And you've got a great website.
Thanks so much.
We are grateful to you both, and thanks to all of you who took time to join us. If you're interested in learning about future webinars or the Online Ethics Center Forum on teaching ethics, the best way to stay in touch is by joining the OEC community, and you can do that by logging on to onlineethics.org. So today's webinar was the last in the spring series, Working Ethics into the Conversation. We'll begin again in September in the fall. Meanwhile, early this summer, the OEC will host a new panel series, Engineering Solutions for the Next Pandemic, Exploring Ethics Concerns. Information will be posted about that soon on the OEC. Thank you all for joining us. We wish you well.